Rollo May introduced existentialism to American psychologists and has remained the best known proponent of this approach in America. Now, trained in a fairly traditional format as a psychoanalyst, may consider the detachment with which psychoanalysts approach their patients as a violation of social ethics. For example, if a psychoanalyst help a patient to be the best they can be, and the person happens to earn their living in an unseemly or criminal manner, it hardly seems proper. So, on the other hand, who is to decide which value should be preferred to a particular society? In the pursuit of freedom, May suggested that sometimes individuals might reasonably oppose the standards of morality or morality of their society. Politics, which is a wonderful topic for lively debate, is dependent on opposing viewpoints. Only when an individual lives an authentic life, however, should their opinions be considered valid, and existential psychology seeks to help individuals live authentic lives. In this video, we're going to talk about Rollo May's existential psychology. We're going to look into his biography, the main ideas of existential psychology, and May's concept of humanity. So, Rollo Rees May was born on April 21, 1909 in Ohio as the first son of the six children born to Earl Title May and Mattie Bolton May. As a young boy, May was not particularly close to either of his parents, who frequently argued with each other and eventually separated. Later in life, May attributed his own two failed marriages to his mother's unpredictable behavior and to his older sister's psychotic episodes. Now, he attended Oberlin College in Ohio, graduating in 1930. Having been interested in art and artistic creativity, he joined with a small group of artists and traveled to Europe, where they studied the local art of Poland. Now, in order to remain in Europe, May took a teaching position with the American College at Salonika in Greece. When not teaching, he traveled widely throughout Greece, Poland, Romania, and Turkey. Wow, sana all. And he attended the summer school taught by no other than Alfred Adler. Deeply impressed by Adler, he nonetheless considered Adler's theory overly simplistic and too general. This may well have been due to his awakening awareness of the tragic side of human life, keeping in mind that much of Europe suffered greatly during the depression between World War I and World War II. So, upon returning to the United States, May worked as a student advisor and the editor of a student magazine at Michigan State University. Now, in 1936, he enrolled at the Union Theological Seminary in New York with the intention of asking and most likely hoping to find answers to the ultimate questions about human life. Despite having no particular desire to become a minister, he did serve in a parish in Montclair, New Jersey for a while. While at the seminary, he became a lifelong friend to Paul Tillich, a well-known existential theologian. Tillich, whose classes May regularly attended, introduced May to the works of Kierkegaard and Heidegger. May also met Kurt Goldstein during this time and became acquainted with Goldstein's theories of self-actualization and anxiety as a reaction by organisms to catastrophic events. Regarding his time as a minister, May reflected that the only events which seemed to include an element of reality were, for him, the funerals. Now, similar to Viktor Frankl, May's life had taken a dramatic turn during this time, an uncontrollable event that threatened his life. May actually contracted tuberculosis. Now, at that time, there were no effective treatments for this contagious disease. Many people died from it. And like many others, Mays had to spend several years at sanitariums. So it was during his time in the sanitarium that May theorized about anxiety and came to one of the most important conclusions in his career. He determined that although Freud had done a masterful job of characterizing the effect of anxiety on the individual, it was actually Kierkegaard who had truly identified with anxiety, or truly identified what anxiety is. So, the threat of becoming nothing. From this point on, May could clearly be identified as an existential psychologist. He collaborated with Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and Gordon Allport to present a symposium on existential psychology in conjunction with the 1959 Annual Convention of American Psychological Association, which led to the publication of a book on that subject. So, as May learned to listen to his body, he discovered that healing is an active, not passive process. The person who is sick, be it physiological or psychological, must be an active participant in the therapeutic process. After May recovered from his illness, he wrote his dissertation on the subject on anxiety, and the next year published it under the title The Meaning of Anxiety. Now, in 1969, May and his first wife, Florence DeFree, were divorced after 30 years of marriage. He later married Ingrid Kepler Scholl, but the marriage too ended in divorce. As May's career continued, he became a supervisor and training analyst at the William Alanson White Institute and an adjunct professor of psychology in the graduate school at New York University. Now, he gave a series of radio talk on existential psychology on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation show. He served as a visiting professor at Harvard and Princeton, and he continued writing. Now, his later books include works on dreams, symbolism, religion, and love. He eventually settled in California, where he died in 1994. Now, that's May's biography. Now, let's talk about his existential psychology. Now, before we talk about the basic concepts of existential psychology, we first need to clarify what existentialism means. First, existence takes precedence over essence. Existence means to emerge or to become. Essence implies a static, immutable substance. Existence suggests process. Essence refers to a product. Existence is associated with growth and change. Essence signifies stagnation and finality. Second, existentialism opposes the split between subject and object. People are both subjective and objective and must search for truth by living active and authentic lives. Third, people search for some meaning to their lives. They ask, though not always consciously, the important questions concerning their being. Fourth is that existentialists hold that ultimately each of us is responsible for who we are and what we become. Fifth is that existentialists are basically anti-theoretical. To them, theories further dehumanize people and render them as objects. Now, the basic concepts of existential psychology can be summarized into two things. First is that they believe in, or may believe in, being in the world, or Dasein, or living with highly meaningful orientation that is aimed at personal growth. Existentialists adopt a phenomenological approach to understanding humanity. To them, we exist in the world that can be best understood from our own perspectives. Now, the basic unit of person and environment is expressed in the German word Dasein, meaning to exist there. Hence, Dasein literally means to exist in the world and is generally written as being in the world, achieving to actually achieve personal growth. Now, as with other existentialists, may believe that alienation is the illness of our time. And it manifests itself in three areas: separation from nature, lack of meaningful interpersonal relationships, and alienation from one's authentic self. Thus, people experience three simultaneous modes in the being in the world: wealth, or the environment around us; myth wealth, or the relations with other people; and eigen wealth, our relationship with ourselves. Now, being in the world necessitates an awareness of a self, uh, of self as a living, emerging being. The awareness in turn leads to the dread of not being, that is, non-being or nothingness. In other words, non-being result from people's detachment to themselves and the world around them. So, people experience anxiety when they become aware that their existence or some value identified with it might be destroyed. May consider anxiety to be the underlying cause of nearly every crisis, whether domestic, professional, economic, or political. He described the world we live in as an age of anxiety. Even though May published The Meaning of Anxiety in 1950, it is safe to say that his concerns are even more relevant today, particularly with the advent of the depersonalization of our world due to the computer age. May considered a wide range of theories on anxiety, including philosophers, neurologists, and major psychodynamic theories, including Freud, Adler, Horney, Sullivan, and Fromm. He came to the conclusion that Freud had done the best job of explaining anxiety, but it was actually, as I have mentioned earlier, Kierkegaard who best understood anxiety. May was particularly impressed by Kierkegaard's idea that anxiety must be understood in the context of an orientation towards freedom. Freedom for him is the goal of personality development, and although this freedom brings with it anxiety, it is through facing this anxiety that the possibility of freedom arises. Now, in defining anxiety, May distinguish between anxiety and fear, and between normal anxiety and neurotic anxiety. According to May, anxiety is the apprehension cued off by a threat to some value which the individual holds essential to his existence as a personality. The threat may be either physical or psychological, such as facing death from tuberculosis or being imprisoned in a concentration camp, which, of course, brought the threat of death in addition to the loss of freedom. Or the threat may challenge some other value that the individual identifies with their existence or personal identity, such as a loss of a career, a divorce, a challenge to patriotism in a time of war. Now, what differentiates anxiety from fear? From fear is that fear is a reaction to a specific event, whereas anxiety is vague and diffuse. For example, after an encounter with a friend who coughed at you, you may fear contracting COVID-19. But in the early days of the pandemic, people all over the world were anxious about the virus. No one can tell when or where you get infected, or even whether the virus is airborne or can live in surfaces of on extended periods. May carefully pointed out that using the term vague and diffuse to describe anxiety should in no way diminish our understanding of the intensity and painfulness that anxiety can bring. Therein lies the difference between normal versus neurotic anxiety. Everyone faces challenges in life, but not everyone sees the same challenges as actual threats. Losing one's job can be an opportunity to begin a new career, perhaps to go back to school to pursue that new career. However, the transition is often difficult, especially when one is used to being the primary wage earner of the family, and also if the family has to cut back on items that they can no longer afford. So anxiety would be a reasonable reaction. Now, that anxiety is considered normal if it is, number one, not disproportionate to the objective threat, number two, does not involve mechanism of intrapsychic conflict, and number three, does not require defense mechanism for its management. Now, normal anxiety is often overlooked in adults since it's not particularly intense, especially compared to neurotic anxiety, and it can be managed constructively. It does not show itself in panic or other dramatic symptoms. Neurotic anxiety is simply the opposite of normal anxiety. It is disproportionate to the objective threat. It does require intrapsychic defense mechanism, and it results in neurotic symptoms in spite of those defense mechanisms. Now, it's important to keep in mind that we should not consider individuals who suffer from neurotic anxieties as suffering from objective weaknesses, but rather they suffer from inner psychological patterns and conflicts that prevent them from using their powers to cope. Now, truth is training in psychodynamic theory may believe that the psychological patterns resulting in the inability to cope have their origin in childhood, particularly due to poor early relations between the infant and its parents. Since an infant's essential values arise from the security patterns established between the infant and its caregivers. Now, one of the most important factors seem to be that infant's subjective interpretation of rejection by its primary caregiver, and that subjectivity is influenced by expectations that form later in life, that of middle and upper class children who expect more support from their parents are especially prone to react to rejection with neurotic anxiety. So, anxiety arises when people are faced with problems of fulfilling their potentialities. Guilt, on the other hand, arises when people deny their potentialities, fail to accurately perceive the need of fellow human beings, or remain obvious to their or oblivious to their presence. On the the natural world. Just as May used the term anxiety to refer to a large issue dealing with one's being in the world, so too did he employ the concept of guilt. Um, um, Now, in this sense, both anxiety and guilt are oncological. That is, they refer to to the nature of being and not to feelings arising from specific situations or transgressions. Now, in all, may recognize three forms of oncological guilt, each corresponding to one of the three modes of being in the world, that is, Umwelt, Mitwelt, and Eigenwelt. To understand the form of guilt that corresponds to Umwelt, recall that oncological guilt needs not stem from one's own actions or failures to act. It can arise from a lack of awareness of one's being in the world. A civilization, or as civilization advances technologically, people become more and more removed from nature, that is, from wealth. This alienation leads to a form of oncological guilt that is especially prevalent in high advanced societies where people live in heated or cool dwellings, use motorized means of transportation, and consume food gathered and prepared by others. People's undiscerning reliance on others for these and other needs contribute to one's first form of oncological guilt, because this type of guilt is a result of our separation from nature, may also refer to it as separation guilt, a concept similar to Fromm's notion of the human dilemma. Now, the second form of guilt stems from our inability to perceive accurately the world of others. Myth, well, or myth, well, we can see other people only through our own eyes and can never perfectly judge the need of these other people. Thus, we do violence to them, to their true identities, because we cannot unerringly anticipate the need of others. We feel inadequate of our relations to them. This then leads to a pervasive condition of guilt, which is experienced by all of us to some extent. May wrote that this is not a question of moral failure. It's an inescapable result of the fact that each of us is a separate individual and has no choice but to look at the world through our own eyes. Now, the third form of oncological guilt is associated with our denial of our own potentialities or our failure to fulfill them. In other words, this guilt is grounded in our relationship with ourself, that is aged well. Again, this form of guilt is universal because none of us completely fulfill our potentials. The third type of guilt is reminiscent of Maslow's concept of the Jonah complex, or the fear of being or doing one's best. Now, like anxiety, oncological guilt can have either a positive or negative effect on people. We can use this guilt to develop a healthy sense of humility, to improve our relationship with others, and to creatively use our potentialities. However, when we refuse to accept oncological guilt, it becomes neurotic or morbid. Neurotic guilt, like neurotic anxiety, leads to non-productive or neurotic symptoms such as sexual impotence, depression, cruelty to others, or inability to make a choice. Now, for someone who talks a lot about anxiety and guilt, love was a very important topic for me. Just how much, simply put, May said that to be capable of giving and receiving mature love is a sound criteria as we have for the fulfilled personality. He further defined love as the delight in the presence of the other person and an affirming of that person's value and development as much as one's own. However, he cautioned that without care, there can be no love, only empty sentimentality or even transient sexual arousal. So, May talked about four types of love in Western tradition, or in even in Westernized tradition. You have sex, eros, philia, and agape. So, sex and eros are closely related, but they are different. Sex is what is called as lust or libido, whereas eros is the drive of love to procreate or create. As changes in society allow the more open study of sex, prompted by the works of people like Sigmund Freud and Masters and Johnsons, May noted three particular paradoxes. First, our so-called enlightenment has not removed the sexual problems in our culture. In the past, an individual could refrain from sexual activity using the moral guidelines of society as an explanation. As casual sex became common, even expected, individuals had to face expressing their own morality as just as that their own. This also created a new source of anxiety for some, namely the possibility that their personal relationships might carry an expectation of sexual activity, and that if they did not comply, they might not be able to continue dating someone they like. So the second paradox is that the new emphasis on technique in sex and lovemaking backfires. Emphasizing techniques or prowess can result in mechanistic attitudes towards making love, possibly leading to alienation, feelings of loneliness, and depersonalization. This can lead to the anticipatory anxiety described by Frankl. Finally, May believe that our sexual freedom was actually a new form of Puritanism. There is a state of alienation from the body, a separation of emotion from reason, and the use of the body as a machine. Whereas in the Victorian era, people tried to be in love without falling into sex. Today, many people try to have sex without falling in love. The third is philia. And the fourth is agape, as I have mentioned earlier. Now, philia and agape are also related to one another, as with sex and love. Philia refers to feelings of friendship or brotherly love, whereas agape is the love devoted to caring for others. Friendships during childhood is very important, and may believe it was essential for meaningful and loving relationships as adults, including those involving eros. Indeed, the tension created by eros, in terms of continuous attraction and continuous passion, would be unbearable if philia did not enter into the equation and allows one to relax in the pleasant and friendly company of the object of one's desires. Now, Harry Harlow once again showed that the opportunity to making friend was as essential in the development of young monkeys as it appears to be in humans. Now, in the West and westernized societies, however, given or highly individualistic and competitive society, deep, meaningful friendships seem to be something of the past, especially among men. Cautions, however, that since the evidence show that, or rather the importance of friendship during development, perhaps we should remember the value of having good friends. Finally, we have agape, a selfless love beyond any hope of gain of oneself. May compare this love to the biological aspect of nature in which a parent will fight to the death in defense of their offspring. With agape, we run the risk of being like God, in the sense that we know others will never act without some degree of their own interest in mind. Similarly, we don't want to be loved in an ethereal sense, or on the other hand, only for our body. We want to be loved completely. So, all true loves involve some elements of the other types of love, no matter how little or how obscure it may be. Now, in the foreword of Love and Will, May acknowledge that some of his readers might find it odd that he combined the two topics in one book, but he felt strongly that the topics actually belong together. He considered both love and will to be interdependent. They are processes in which people reach out to influence others, to help to mold and create the consciousness of others. Love without will is sentimental and experimental, whereas will without love is manipulative. Only by remaining open to the influences of others can we likewise influence them. So love must have an honest purpose, and purpose must be taken with care. Will, or willpower as it is more commonly known, was one of the earliest subjects in American psychology. May considered Sigmund Freud's greatest discovery to be the uncovering of unconscious desires and motives. Although many people may believe themselves to be acting out of higher ideals, most of us are in reality acting according to psychologically determined factors, of which we are unaware of. Nonetheless, may consider this to be one of the most unfortunate results of Freud's work. By accepting determinism, we undermine the influence of will and making decisions. As May puts it, Freud's theory suggests that we are not driving anymore, but being driven. Uh, the suggestion that we are no longer in charge of our own lives, that we are driven by psychological determinism, seems strange to those who believe that never before have people had such power, both in terms of individual freedom and in the collective conquest of nature. But May referred to the contradiction in will as the contrast between our feelings of powerlessness and self-doubt, and the societal assurance that we can do anything we set our minds to. May believe that we exist in a curious predicament, in that the technical wonders that make us feel so powerful as are the very same processes that overwhelm us. Thus, the crisis in will does not arise from either the presence or absence of power in the individual's world. It comes from the contradiction between the result of which is a paralysis of will. Our task, said May, is to unite love and will. This task is not easy, but it's possible. Neither blissful love nor self-serving will have a role in our in uniting of in uniting of love and will. For the mature person, both love and will mean are reaching out towards another person. Both involve care, both necessitate choice, both imply action, and both require responsibility. Similar to what Eric Fromm said. Now, will alone is not the driving force that lead us to responsible and authentic lives. Underlying will is something May called as intentionality. Intentionality is the structure that gives meaning to experience, according to May. It's both how we perceive the world and how the world can be perceived by us. In other words, through our conceptual processes, we influence the world around us. We affect the world or the very things that we perceive. Intentionality is the bridge between subject and object. Okay, so compare this once again to the nothingness between beings and between beings and capital beings with capital B as a Heidegger, or between Ensoy and the Porsoy a la Sartre. So still our ability to reach and form the very objects that we perceive. In other words, to participate actively in our lives can be dramatically curtailed by the problems addressed by May early in his career, that is anxiety. Overwhelming anxiety destroys the capacity to perceive and conceive one's own world, to reach out towards it, to form and to reform it. So, in this sense, it destroys intentionality. We cannot hope, plan, promise, or create in severe anxiety. We shrink back into a stockade of limited consciousness, hoping only to persevere or to preserve ourselves until the danger is past. So, uh, now, a blend of other four forms of love require both assertion and affirmation of the other person. It actually also requires an assertion of one's freedom and a confrontation with one's destiny. Now, according to May, healthy individuals are able to both assume their freedom and to face their destiny. Kind of contradicting, but we will talk about this more. Now, May said that freedom is the individual's capacity to know that he is the determined one. The word determined is, in this definition, is synonymous with what May would later call destiny. Freedom then comes from an understanding of our destiny. Freedom entails being able to harbor different possibilities in our minds. And even though it's not clear at the moment which way one must act. So this condition often leads to increases in anxiety, but it's normal anxiety, the kind that healthy people welcome and are able to manage. May actually discuss two forms of freedom. You have existential freedom and essential freedom. Existential freedom should not be identified with existential philosophy. It's the freedom of action, the freedom of doing, freedom to act on the choice that one makes. Freedom to act, to move around, does not ensure what he called essential freedom, that is freedom of being. May argues that the freedom we enjoy in Western and Westernized societies like the Philippines often hampers our ability to experience essential freedom. Okay, hear me out. In fact, it is often those denied freedom of choice that experience essential freedom. Prisoners speak of their inner freedom. Another existential theorist, Viktor Frankl, actually wrote his seminal book, Man's Search for Meaning, after being in a concentration camp. Now, this is where he discovered his essential freedom. He decided that one thing the Nazis could not take from him, as they had taken everything else, was who he would be. So, essential freedom is the freedom of being. Now, according to May, the definition of a myth is quite simple. It's a way of making sense in a senseless world. In addition, myths give substance to our existence. In a healthy society, the myths provide relief from neurotic guilt and excessive anxiety. And so, a compassionate therapist will not discourage them. In the 20th century, especially in Western cultures, we have lost, and westernized cultures that is, we actually lost our myths. And with them, we have lost our sense of existence and our direction or purpose in life. The danger in this is that people are then susceptible to cults, drugs, superstitions, and so on, in a vain attempt to replace that purpose. As we pass through the experiences of our lives, in our memory is dependent, or rather, our memory is dependent mainly upon myths. It's well, it is well accepted today that human memory is constructive and influenced by our expectations of memory. As May described it, the formulation of a memory, regardless of whether it's real or fantasy, is molded like clay. We then retain it as myths and rely on it. On that myth for future guidance in similar situations. For example, an infant is fed 3 times a day and put to bed 365 days a year. And yet they remember only one or two of these events from their years of early childhood. For whatever reason, good or bad, according to May, these specific events take on mythic proportions and greatly influence the course of our lives. May acknowledges the contribution of Alfred Adler in recognizing the value of these early memories, describing Adler as a perceptive and humble man. He was gifted with unusual sensitivity for children. As we have seen, Adler considered the basis for neurosis to be a lack of social interest. In therapy, Adler focused on the guiding fiction of a child's life, something May considered to be synonymous with the myth. Since memory is the mother of creativity and memory depends upon myth, May believe that the myths that form the identity of our culture are essential for the formulation of ourselves. If you think about it, May's concept of myth is comparable to Carl Jung's idea of collective unconscious in that myths are archetypal patterns in the human experience. They are avenues to universal images that lie beyond individual experience, and like archetypes, myths can contribute to psychological growth if people will embrace them and allow them to open up new realities. Tragically, many people deny their universal myth and thus risk alienation, apathy, and emptiness, the principal ingredients of psychopathology, according to May. Now, May believe that the Oedipus story is a powerful myth in our culture because it contains elements of essential crisis common to everyone. These crises include birth, separation or exile from parents and home, sexual union with one parent and hostility towards the other, the assertion of independence and the search for identity, and lastly, that of death. Now, the Oedipus myth has meanings for people because it deals with each of these five crises. Like Oedipus, people are removed from their mothers and fathers and are driven by the need for self-knowledge. People's struggle for self-identity, however, is not easy, and it may even result in tragedy, as it did for Oedipus when he insisted of knowing the truth about his origins. After being told that he had killed his father and married his mother, Oedipus put out his eyes, depriving himself of the ability to see, that is, to be aware or to be conscious. Now, this ends our discussion of existential psychology. Let's now move on to May's concept of humanity. May actually believe that many people have surrendered some of their abilities to choose, but that capitulation itself, he insisted, is a choice. May therefore must be rated high on dimension of free choice. Although he sometimes painted a rather gloomy picture of humanity, May was not pessimistic. And although May recognized the potential impact of childhood experiences on adult personality, he clearly favored teleology over causality. On the dimension of uniqueness versus similarity, May viewed humanity definitely leans less towards uniqueness. Uh, May emphasis on phenomenology implies individual's perception and therefore unique personality. Um, Lastly, May assumes a moderate stance on the issue of conscious versus unconscious forces in personality development. By their nature, May believe that people have enormous capacity for self-awareness, but often that capacity remains fallow. May also took an intermediate position on social versus biological influences. They believe that society contributes to personality principally through interpersonal relationships. So that ends our discussion on Rollo May's existential psychology. My name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.